The sound was wet. That was the only way Dr. Arlen Glass could describe it, as he sat alone in the humming dark of the Black Mesa Observatory. For 50 years, humanity had listened to the signal. A faint, repeating whisper from the direction of the Kepler-186 F-star system. We called it the ghost. A billion theories bloomed in the silence between its pulses. A beacon, a map, a desperate, lonely cry for help from a dying civilization. We sent our own messages back, filled with math and music and pictures of smiling, naked people. We shouted our existence into the void, hoping for a friend. Tonight, the ghost stopped whispering and started talking, and the sound it made was wet. It was the sound of a predator tearing into its meal. A cosmic, amplified sound of ripping flesh and snapping bone. It was the sound of sloping, gluttonous satisfaction. Arlen's blood went cold in his veins. His coffee cup slipped from his numb fingers and shattered on the concrete floor. The 50-year-old mystery was solved. The signals weren't a plea for help. They were a dinner bell, and for half a century we had been screaming back, "We are here. We are soft. We are delicious." The main screen, which usually displayed a clean, elegant waveform of the ghost signal, was now a jagged, chaotic mess. It looked like an electrocardiogram during a fatal heart attack. The audio feed which Arlen had routed through the main speakers in a moment of scientific curiosity now filled the control room with that guttural, stomach-turning noise. It was a broadcast of something feasting, and it was coming from the stars. Arlen scrambled for the volume knob, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip it. He twisted it hard to the left, and the room plunged back into the blessed humming silence of the servers. He stood there panting, his heart a wild bird beating against the cage of his ribs. His mind, a place of logic and reason, was fracturing. It couldn't be. An audio illusion, a feedback loop. A glitch in the billion-dollar equipment he oversaw. He was the director of this lonely outpost on a New Mexico mesa, a place where the sky was so clear you could fall into it. He was a man of science. Science had explanations. He forced himself to sit back down, his chair squeaking in protest. He stared at the waveform on the screen. It was still there, a chaotic, ugly scribble of cosmic violence. He ran a diagnostic. All systems green. He recalibrated the receiver. The signal remained. He bypassed the primary amplifier, thinking it might be malfunctioning. The signal sharpened, the jagged peaks and troughs becoming even more defined. It wasn't a glitch. It was real. A new pulse of data began to stream in. This was different. Not the wet chewing sound. This was a new layer to the transmission, something buried underneath the noise of the feast. It was a series of sharp, rhythmic clicks. Arlen's training took over, his panic momentarily shoved aside by a lifetime of professional habit. He isolated the new frequency. It was a pattern. Simple, mathematical. It was a countdown. Not from 10 or 100. It was a countdown from 3, a series of 3 distinct clicks, a pause, then 3 more, over and over. 3, pause, 3, pause, 3. Then another sound emerged, layered over the clicks. It was fainter, harder to grasp. It sounded like a voice, but not a voice made of lungs and larynx. It was a voice made of static and gravity, a voice that bent the very air in the room. It whispered a single impossible word. It whispered it in perfect, unaccented English. Coming. Arlen lurched back from the console as if it were white hot. He stumbled backwards, tripping over his own feet and landing hard on the floor next to the shattered remains of his coffee cup. He stared up at the control panel, at the blinking green lights that had always been a comfort, a sign that humanity's ear was pressed firmly to the door of the universe. Now they looked like the hungry green eyes of a monster. The clicks continued their steady rhythm from the silent speakers, the data still streaming onto the screen. 3. Pause. 3. Pause. And in the humming silence of the room, Arlen imagined he could still hear that impossible whisper. Coming. He had spent his entire career, his entire life, listening for a sign of intelligence in the vast, empty darkness. He had found it. And it was coming to hunt. The silence of space was not empty. It was the patient quiet of a predator, waiting for its prey to make a sound. We had made a sound. We had shouted and sung and waved our arms, and now the long wait was over. The hunt had begun. The desert morning did little to burn away the chill that had settled deep in Arlen's bones. The sun rose over the jagged peaks of the distant mountains, painting the scrubland in hues of orange and pink. But the beauty felt like a mask on a corpse. He hadn't slept. He'd spent the night chain smoking on the observatory's catwalk, watching the stars which no longer looked like distant, twinkling friends. They looked like eyes. His second-in-command, Maya Chen, arrived just after 7, her beat-up electric car kicking up a cloud of dust. She was young, brilliant, and pathologically skeptical. She lived in the tiny town of Oro Grande, 20 miles down the mountain, and treated the ghost signal with a kind of professional disdain. For her, it was just a data stream to be managed, not a cosmic pen pal. "You look like hell, Arlen," she said, setting her thermos on the console. She didn't even glance at the main screen. "I didn't sleep," he said. His voice was a raw croak. "Let me guess." The ghost said something new and profound in its alien space language. She poured herself a cup of tea, the picture of calm competence. "Something like that," Arlen mumbled. He had to tell her. He couldn't carry this alone. But how? How do you tell a rational, grounded scientist that you heard God's butcher shop on the radio last night? "I rerouted the audio feed," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "Through the main speakers?" Maya raised an eyebrow. "Against protocol. The raw feed can damage the cones. What were you hoping to hear? A symphony?" "Just listen," he said, his hand hovering over the controls. He looked at her, pleading. "Just keep an open mind." She sighed, a long-suffering puff of air. "Fine. But if you blew out a $5,000 speaker, it's coming out of your paycheck." Arlen turned the volume knob, not all the way, just a crackle. The sound filled the room, the wet, tearing, chewing sound. It was quieter now, as if the feast was winding down, but it was still unmistakably gruesome. Maya froze, her cup halfway to her lips. Her face, usually set in an expression of wry amusement, went slack with confusion. "What is that? Is that feedback?" "It's the signal, Maya. That's what it sounds like." She set her cup down with a clatter and walked over to the console, her eyes narrowed. She stared at the chaotic waveform on the screen. "Number. That's impossible. It's noise. Interference. A solar flare." "I've checked everything," Arlen said, his voice gaining a desperate strength. "It's clean. It's coming from Kepler, minus 186F. This is it. This is the ghost." Maya began typing furiously, her fingers flying across the keyboard, running her own diagnostics. Her face was a mask of intense concentration. She muttered to herself, listing off potential sources of contamination. Atmospheric distortion, satellite reflection, could be a magnetar burst echoing in the ore cloud. While she worked, the maintenance man, Jed, shuffled in. He was a local, a man whose family had lived in the shadow of the mesa for generations. He had leathery skin and eyes that had seen more sunsets than Arlen had seen data packets. "Morning, Doc," he grunted, carrying a toolbox. "Got a weird one for you." Arlen tore his eyes away from Maya. "What is it, Jed?" "Coyotes," Jed said, pulling a greasy rag from his back pocket and wiping his hands. "All of them. Down in the canyon. They're all just quiet." "Quiet?" Maya asked, not looking up from her screen. "Coyotes are nocturnal. They're supposed to be quiet in the morning." "No, Mom, not like this," Jed said, shaking his head slowly. "I've lived here my whole life. There's always yips and howls at dawn and dusk. Always. This morning? Nothing. Not a peep. And the birds too. It's like the whole damn desert is holding its breath." Arlen felt a fresh wave of ice water in his gut. The predator was here. The smaller animals knew. They had fallen silent, hoping not to be noticed. "It's a coincidence," Maya snapped, her voice tight with frustration. Her diagnostics were all coming back clean. The data was irrefutable. The sound was coming from the source. "Arlen, this is a pareidolia effect. The brain is creating a pattern, a sound from random noise. We're hearing what we want to hear, or in your case, what you're terrified of hearing." "And the clicks?" Arlen asked, his voice low. "Are they a pattern too?" He isolated the rhythmic clicking sound. 3 sharp pulses. A pause. 3 more. Maya stared at the screen, her own confident logic beginning to fray at the edges. The clicks were undeniably a pattern. Too precise, too regular to be random. 3, Arlen said. It was counting down from 3. It did it all night. Just as he said it, the pattern on the screen changed. The clicking stopped. For a moment, there was only the faint, wet background noise. Then, a new set of clicks began. They were slower, more deliberate. 2 sharp pulses, a pause. 2 more. Maya's face went pale. She looked from the screen to Arlen, her skepticism finally cracking, revealing the fear beneath. "It's counting down," Arlen whispered. The countdown had started at 3. Now it was at 2. "Counting down to what?" Maya breathed, her voice barely audible. Before Arlen could answer, a high-pitched alarm blared through the control room. A flashing red light pulsed on the main console. It was the proximity alert for the observatory's perimeter fence. Jed, startled, dropped his wrench. "What in tarnation is that? We ain't had a perimeter breach in 5 years." He grabbed his radio. "Jed to gate. What's going on down there?" "Is it another tourist?" Static crackled back, then a voice young and panicked. It was Billy, the kid on the security detail. "Jed, I don't know. All the power's out at the gatehouse. Something's out here. Something big. It's messing with the fence." "What do you see, Billy?" Jed yelled into the radio. There was a long moment of static. Then Billy's voice came back tight with terror. "Nothing. I can't see anything. But I can hear it. It sounds like the radio." He meant the signal. He could hear the signal without a radio. A choked, wet sound came through the speaker, followed by a scream that was cut short by a burst of static. Then silence. The silence that followed Billy's scream was heavier than any sound. It filled the control room, pressing in on them. Jed stood frozen, the radio clutched in his hand, his knuckles white. Maya stared at the silent speaker, her face a bloodless mask of horror. The scientific detachment she wore like armor had been stripped away, leaving her raw and exposed. "Billy," Jed croaked into the radio. "Billy, you answer me, son." Only static answered, a dead empty hiss. Arlen felt a strange, cold calm descend upon him. The terror was still there, a block of ice in his chest, but his mind was working with a desperate clarity. The abstract threat from the stars was no longer abstract. It was here, it was at their gate. "Kill the broadcast?" Maya whispered, her voice shaking. "Turn it off, if they're homing in on it." "We can't," Arlen said, his own voice sounding distant to his ears. "We're a receiver, not a transmitter. We're just listening. We've been listening for 50 years. They're not homing in on our broadcast. They're homing in on the one we were listening to. They followed the dinner bell right to the table." He looked at the main screen. The countdown had changed again. The slow, deliberate pulse of 2 clicks had stopped. Now there was only one. A single, sharp click. A pause, then another single click. It was a slow, final heartbeat 1. Pause 1. "What do we do?" Maya asked, her eyes wide with panic. "We call someone, the police, the military." "And tell them what?" Arlen shot back, a hysterical laugh bubbling in his throat. "That a ghost signal from space ate our security guard. They'd lock us up." "We have to do something," she insisted. Jed finally moved. He set the radio down gently on the console, as if it were a holy relic. He turned to them, his old eyes clear and hard. "The town. We need to warn Oro Grande." Arlen shook his head. "How, Jed? The power's out at the gate. The landlines are probably dead too. And I'm betting our cell phones don't work either." Maya pulled her phone from her pocket. No signal. Arlen's was the same. They were cut off. A tiny island of technology in a vast, silent desert. And the tide was coming in. "My truck," Jed said, the old Ford. "No computers in that thing. It'll run. I can get down the mountain." "You're not going out there," Arlen said firmly. "Whatever happened to Billy?" "That boy had a family," Jed said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "The folks in town have families. I'm going." Before they could argue further, a low, deep hum began to vibrate through the floor. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It felt organic, like the purr of a colossal cat. The lights in the control room flickered, buzzed, and then died, plunging them into near darkness. Only the emergency backup lights, casting a sickly red glow, and the luminous green of the computer screens remained. "What was that?" Maya gasped. "They're here," Arlen said. It wasn't a guess. It was a certainty. The hum was the sound of their arrival. It was the sound of reality bending around them. He moved to the large window that overlooked the observatory grounds. The sun was higher now, a bright, unforgiving eye in the blue sky. The grounds looked empty. The giant white radio dish, 100 meters across, stood silent and stark against the desert landscape. Everything looked normal, except it wasn't. The shadows were wrong. The sun was high into the east, so the shadows should be sharp and angled to the west. But they weren't. The shadow of the main dish was twisted, bent at an impossible angle, as if being cast by 2 suns. And it was moving. It writhed on the dusty ground like a living thing, stretching and contracting in ways that defied the laws of physics. "Look," Arlen whispered, pointing. Maya and Jed joined him at the window. They saw it too. Maya let out a small, choked cry. Jed muttered a prayer under his breath. The hum grew louder, resonating in their chests. And then they saw it. At the edge of the twisted shadow, the air began to shimmer, like heat haze on a summer road. But this was no heat haze. It was a distortion, a ripple in the fabric of the world. It was a patch of air that didn't belong. It was a place where the rules of light and space were being rewritten. A dead jackrabbit lay on the ground near the shimmering patch. As they watched, the rabbit began to change. Its fur dissolved, not burning, but just unmaking itself. Its flesh turned gray and seemed to run like melted wax. In seconds, all that was left was a pile of desiccated bones and a puff of fine gray dust that was immediately sucked into the shimmering distortion. It wasn't just eating flesh, it was eating matter. It was eating existence itself. "It's a blind spot," Arlen breathed, a horrifying realization dawning on him. "It's not a creature. It's a hole in the universe. They don't travel through space. They punch holes in it." The countdown on the screen stopped. The single click was gone. It was replaced by a flat line, 0. The hum intensified, shaking the very foundations of the building. The glass in the window began to vibrate, a high-pitched keen filling the air. Outside, the shimmering distortion grew larger, more violent. It was no longer just a patch of air. It was a vortex, a whirlpool of non-being, and it was moving slowly, deliberately, toward the control room. "The door!" Jed yelled, snapping them out of their horrified trance. "We have to barricade the door." He grabbed a heavy metal table, and Arlen helped him shove it against the control room's main entrance. Maya, shaking, began dragging chairs and cabinets, piling them up. It was a futile gesture, they all knew it. How do you barricade a door against something that can unmake the door? But they had to do something. The human need to act, to fight, even in the face of the impossible, took over. As they worked, a new sound came from the speakers. The feast was over. The countdown was done. This was something new. It was a low, guttural growl, a sound of pure planetary scale hunger. And it was no longer coming from Kepler -186f. It was coming from right outside their window. The hunters had arrived, and they were ready for their next meal. The growl from the speakers wasn't just a sound. It was a physical pressure. It vibrated in Arlen's teeth and echoed in the hollow spaces of his skull. Outside, the shimmering vortex of wrongness had reached the base of the control building. The concrete began to flake away at its touch, not crumbling, but simply ceasing to be, turning into motes of gray dust that were drawn into the vortex. "It's eating the building," Maya said, her voice a flat, dead thing. The scientist in her was still observing, still cataloging, even as the world ended around her. "We're in a damn lunchbox," Jed spat, his eyes darting around the room, looking for a weapon, an escape, anything. Arlen's mind was racing, trying to connect the pieces, the signal, the feast, the countdown, the vortex. It wasn't just a hunt. It was a process, a systematic, engineered process. He stumbled back to the main console, his eyes scanning the data streams. The audio from the ghost signal was now identical to the sound coming from outside. A perfect match. "They're not just hunters," Arlen said, thinking aloud. "They're engineers, or terraformers of a sort." "What are you talking about?" Maya cried, her voice cracking. "We're about to be erased from existence, and you're having a scientific epiphany. Don't you see? Arlen's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up old data, archived signals from years ago. The original signal. The one we called the ghost. It wasn't just a hunting call. It was more than that. It was phase 1. He brought up a waveform of the signal from a decade ago. It was clean, simple, rhythmic. This was the lure, the friendly pulse. Hello, are you there? Simple, non-threatening, designed to attract the curious. He switched to a more recent signal from a year ago. The waveform was more complex, with subtle layers of new information buried within it. Phase 2. They get a response. They know someone is listening. So they start sending more data, not language, something more fundamental. They're broadcasting the blueprint for their own physics. The hum, Maya breathed, understanding dawning in her eyes. The sound we've been hearing, it's a resonance frequency. They're tuning the space around us, like a singer shattering a glass with her voice. Exactly, Alan confirmed. They're not traveling here. They're making here become there. They're overwriting our reality with their own. The vortex isn't a ship. It's a beachhead. A bubble of their universe expanding into ours. A loud crack echoed through the room as a section of the reinforced window fractured. A spiderweb of cracks spreading from a point where the shimmering nothingness outside had touched it. "And the feast?" Jed asked, his back pressed against the barricaded door. "What was that sound we heard first?" Arlen's face was grim. He pulled up the recording from the previous night. The wet, tearing sounds. Phase 3, the final broadcast. It's a confirmation. The tuning is complete. The local environment is now hospitable. It's a message to the rest of them. The meal is ready. That sound. That wasn't them eating something light years away. That was a recording, a playback. The galactic equivalent of ringing a bell and shouting, "Soup's on." The final horrifying piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The ghost signal wasn't a call from one hunter to its prey. It was a complex, automated system. A trap laid across the galaxy, patient and deadly. A lure, a reality-warping device. And finally, an all-clear signal. And humanity, in its loneliness and curiosity, had listened intently to every single stage, practically helping them set the table. "So what now?" Jed asked, his voice low and steady. "What's phase 4? "Phase 4 is consumption," Arlen said. The growl outside intensified, and the entire building shuddered. The emergency lights flickered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness, save for the green glow of the monitors. In the blackness, the sound was everything. The deep, hungry growl, the high-pitched keen of the vibrating glass. The soft, sifting sound of the concrete walls being unmade. And a new sound, a scratching. It was coming from the door, not the loud, splintering crash of something trying to break it down. It was a soft, methodical scratching, like a single fingernail being dragged across the metal. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. Pause. Jed aimed his heavy-duty flashlight at the door. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the thick steel. There was nothing there, but the scratching sound continued, seeming to come from the very molecules of the metal itself. Then they saw it. A thin, dark line was appearing on the door, tracing the path of the invisible scratching. It wasn't a scratch on the surface. The metal was being unwritten. A line of non-existence being drawn through the steel. The line grew longer, curving around to form a circle. A perfect circle, about the size of a human head. The scratching stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, with a soft final pop, the circle of steel vanished. not falling inward or outward, it just ceased to be. In its place was a perfect circular hole in the door. Through it, they could see the corridor outside. But the corridor was wrong. The fluorescent lights were flickering with a black, oily light. The walls seemed to sweat a dark, viscous fluid, and standing there, looking through the hole, was a shape. It wasn't a monster of claws and fangs. It was worse. It was a column of pure distortion, a human-shaped patch of the same shimmering wrongness as the vortex outside. It had a head, arms, a torso, but they were made of bent light and twisted space. It was a man-shaped hole in the world, and it was looking right at them. It raised an arm made of rippling air, and from the speakers on the console, which were now perfectly in sync with the creature, came that single, static-laced word they had heard before. Coming. The hunter had come to collect them. The thing in the hallway, the man-shaped void, took a step forward. It didn't make a sound, but the floor tiles where its foot should have landed dissolved into gray dust. The barricade of tables and chairs in its path began to smoke and warp, their very atomic structure coming undone. Jed let out a guttural roar, a sound of pure primal defiance. He was a man who fixed things with his hands, who understood engines and pipes and solid matter. This was an affront to his entire world. He hefted the heavy steel wrench he had dropped earlier. "Get behind me," he growled at Arlen and Maya. "Jed, no," Arlen screamed. "You can't fight it." But Jed was already moving. He charged at the door, at the hole. His face, a mask of rage. He swung the wrench with all his might, aiming for the head of the distorted figure. The wrench passed through the shimmering shape with no resistance at all. It was like swinging at smoke. But the figure reacted. Its arm, a swirl of bent light, lashed out and touched Jed's shoulder. There was no impact, no blood. Jed just stopped. He froze mid-swing, his expression of rage locked on his face, and then he began to unravel. It started with his plaid shirt. The color drained from it, turning to a uniform gray. Then the fabric itself lost its texture, its weave, and dissolved into a cloud of fine particles. His skin followed, the leathery tan of his arms and face turning ashen, and then simply disappearing. It was happening impossibly fast. He was being unwritten from reality, molecule by molecule. His eyes, wide with a final, uncomprehending terror, were the last things to go, 2 dark spots that faded into nothingness. In less than 3 seconds, Jed was gone. The heavy wrench he had been holding clattered to the floor, all that was left of him. Maya screamed, a raw, piercing sound of absolute horror. She stumbled backward, tripping and falling, crab-walking away from the door, her eyes fixed on the spot where Jed had just ceased to exist. The figure of wrongness tilted its head. The growl from the speakers softened, replaced by a series of inquisitive clicks. It seemed to be processing what had just happened. It had encountered resistance, and it was learning. Arlen, his mind numb with shock and grief, grabbed Maya's arm and pulled her to her feet. "Move! Now!" he yelled, dragging her away from the door, deeper into the control room. The creature stepped through the now unobstructed doorway. It didn't bother with the hole it had made. It simply passed through the solid steel of the door, as if it were not there. The barricade of furniture vanished into dust as it moved through it. It was inside the room with them. The hum grew deafening. The air grew thick and hard to breathe, tasting of ozone and dust. The remaining computer monitors flickered violently, their screens displaying static and alien geometries that hurt the eyes. "The back room!" Arlen shouted, pointing to the server room at the far end of the control center. It had a heavy, fire-rated door. It wouldn't hold the creature for long, but it was their only option. He shoved Maya toward it. She moved like a sleepwalker, her eyes still locked on the shimmering horror that was advancing on them. The creature was slow, deliberate. It seemed to be in no hurry. It was savoring the hunt. Arlen looked around wildly. A weapon. He needed a weapon. But what could you use against a hole in the universe? His eyes fell on the shattered remains of his coffee cup, and a desperate, insane idea sparked in his mind. The feast, the wet tearing sound. That was the sound of consumption, of matter being broken down. But it was also a sound of frequency. What if they could fight sound with sound? The main dish, he yelled to Maya as they scrambled into the server room. The broadcast system. It's a receiver, Arlen, she cried back, her voice hysterical. It doesn't transmit. It can be modified, he shouted, slamming the heavy server room door shut and throwing the thick steel bolt. There's a bypass, a maintenance protocol. We can reverse the polarity and turn the whole dish into a giant speaker. Or a weapon. The scratching sound began on the server room door. Soft, methodical. It was drawing another circle. Arlen's mind was a whirlwind. He was no engineer, but he had seen Jed work on the system a dozen times. He knew the theory. The main dish collected faint radio waves and focused them onto a hypersensitive receiver. If they could overload that receiver, feed it a massive, chaotic signal from their own systems, and then reverse the energy flow, maybe, just maybe, they could create a focused blast of pure sonic and electromagnetic chaos. It might do nothing. It might tear the whole mountain apart. It might just be enough to disrupt the creature's own resonance frequency. The main power conduit is in here, he said, his voice urgent. He pointed to a large, yellow metal box on the wall, covered in warning labels. If I can bypass the safety cutoffs and route all the power from the backup generators directly into the dish's amplifier, you'll create a feedback loop that could fuse every circuit in this entire facility, Maya said, the scientist in her still fighting through the terror. It's better than being turned into dust, Arlen shot back. He ripped the cover off the power box, revealing a terrifying tangle of thick cables and switches. He didn't know exactly what he was doing, but he knew the principles. Maximum power, no safeguards. The scratching on the door stopped. A moment of silence. Then the soft pop as a circle of steel ceased to exist. Maya shrieked and pressed herself into the corner of the room, as far from the door as she could get. The man-shaped hole appeared in the opening. It paused, its form rippling. It seemed to be studying the humming racks of servers that filled the room. This was the brain of the observatory. This was the place where the signals it had sent were received, decoded, and stored. This was the consciousness of the place. This was the choicest part of the meal. It ignored Arlen, who was frantically pulling at thick cables with his bare hands, sparks flying around him. It ignored Maya, cowering in the corner. It moved toward the central server rack, a tall black monolith of blinking lights. It reached out a shimmering, distorted hand. "Arlen, now!" Maya screamed. Arlen found a heavy insulated lever, the main circuit breaker for the entire system. He knew that pulling it would connect the backup generators directly to the main amplifier, bypassing every safety protocol. It was a 1,000,000,000-to-1 shot. He took a deep breath, shouted Jed's name, and pulled the lever down with all his might. The moment Arlen threw the lever, The world turned into a single, deafening scream of pure energy. The humming servers shrieked like tortured animals. The lights didn't just flicker, they exploded in showers of sparks and glass. A wave of force, palpable and immense, threw Arlen back against the far wall. His head connected with the concrete, and for a second, the world went black. He came to, dazed and groaning, to a scene from a technological hell. The server racks were melting, their plastic and metal components dripping onto the floor in glowing, molten puddles. The air was thick with the smell of burnt ozone and melted silicon. The fire suppression system kicked in, filling the room with a choking white foam. But the hum was gone. The deep, resonant thrum of the hunter's presence had been replaced by the raw, chaotic noise of an overloaded electrical grid tearing itself apart. Arlen pushed himself up, his vision swimming. Through the foam and smoke, he saw Maya. She was on her feet, staring at the doorway. Her expression wasn't one of terror anymore. It was one of stunned disbelief. Arlen followed her gaze. The man-shaped hole was still there, but it was flickering. It was like a bad television signal. Its form kept breaking apart, dissolving into static, then reforming, but weaker each time. The focused blast of energy from the dish had disrupted its cohesion. They had hurt it. The creature seemed to be in agony. A sound tore from the speakers, no longer a confident growl, but a high-pitched digital screech of pain. It was a sound of systems failing, of reality code corrupting. It recoiled from the melting server racks, its shimmering form contracting. It was losing its grip on their world. It turned its flickering, distorted gaze on Arlen. A new sound came from the speakers now, a sound of rage. It had been wounded. Its prey was fighting back. It lunged, not with the slow, deliberate pace of before, but with a desperate, wounded fury. It crossed the room in an instant, a blur of unraveling space. Arlen had no time to move, no time to even cry out. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the touch that would unmake him. But it never came. A heavy, metallic clang echoed through the room. Arlen opened his eyes. Maya was standing in front of him, holding a thick steel server panel she had wrenched from a smoking rack. She had thrown it. Not at the creature, but in its path. The creature had not passed through it. It had collided with it. The panel was embedded in its shimmering form, and the creature was struggling against it, its distorted shape warping and flowing around the solid piece of metal like water around a rock. "It's weak," Maya yelled, her voice filled with a wild, newfound strength. The blast made it more solid. It can't phase through things anymore. The creature let out another digital shriek and flung the server panel aside. The metal clattered against the wall, glowing cherry red where the creature had touched it, but it was still solid. It hadn't been unmade. It was vulnerable. The realization hit Arlen like a physical blow. The hunters weren't gods. They were just technologically advanced. Incredibly, reality-bendingly advanced, but not invincible. Their ability to phase through matter to unwrite reality was a projection, a technology. And Arlen's desperate, brute force attack had damaged the projector. The creature was still deadly, a vortex of energy that could cook a man alive. But it was no longer a ghost. It was a physical entity, bound however loosely to the laws of this reality. It could be fought. It turned its fury on Maya. It raised its shimmering arm, which now crackled with visible arcs of blue electricity. "Hey!" Arlen shouted, grabbing the heaviest thing he could find, a fire extinguisher from the wall. "Over here, you glitch in the system." The creature's head shape swiveled toward him. It seemed confused, its predatory programming struggling to cope with this turn of events. Its prey was not cowering. Its prey was taunting it. It changed its target, moving toward Arlen. He hefted the fire extinguisher, his heart pounding. It felt absurdly small and useless, but it was solid. It was real. As the creature advanced, Arlen saw something that made his blood run cold. Its flickering was becoming less frequent. Its form was stabilizing. It was adapting, recovering. The effect of the blast was wearing off. In a minute, it would be back to full strength, an untouchable ghost of pure destruction. They didn't have much time. "Maya, the dish!" Arlen yelled, backing away from the advancing hunter. "Can we do it again?" "No! The conduits are melted! The whole system is fused!" she shouted back, her eyes wide as she watched the creature's form grow more stable, the blue arcs of energy around it intensifying. "Then we have to get out of here," Arlen yelled. "Out of the building. Maybe it's tied to this place, to the receiver." It was a desperate hope, but it was all they had. He looked at the door. The hole was still there. Beyond it, the main control room was a disaster zone of smoke and shattered glass. And beyond that, the main exit. "On my signal," Arlen said, his knuckles white around the handle of the fire extinguisher. "Run for the main door. Don't stop for anything." He looked at Maya. Her face was grim, streaked with foam and soot, but the terror was gone, replaced by a hard, brittle resolve. She nodded. The creature was only a few feet away from Arlen now. The heat coming off it was intense, making his skin feel tight and dry. The air crackled around it. "Now!" Arlen screamed. He swung the fire extinguisher with all his strength, not at the creature, but at the last intact server rack next to it. The heavy canister smashed into the metal, which in turn toppled over onto the hunter. The creature shrieked as the tons of metal and electronics crashed down on it, pinning it. It didn't unmake the servers. It was trapped beneath them, its shimmering form thrashing and sending out waves of destructive energy. Maya was already running. She vaulted over the wreckage, through the hole in the door, and into the main control room. Arlen was right behind her. They didn't look back. They ran past the spot where Jed had died, past the console that had been the source of all their woe. They burst through the main exit and out into the blinding light of the desert sun. They ran. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs screamed, not stopping until they reached the ridge overlooking the observatory. They collapsed behind a cluster of rocks, gasping for air, and looked back. The observatory was silent. Smoke poured from the windows of the control building. And the giant, 100-meter radio dish, their window to the universe, was slumping, its white surface blackened and warped, great tears appearing in its metal mesh. Arlen's desperate gambit had destroyed it. They had deafened themselves. But as they watched, a shimmer began to form in the air above the ruined dish. A distortion. Then another, next to it. And another. They were smaller than the vortex from before, flickering and unstable, like reflections in a broken mirror. The first hunter had been a scout, a vanguard. Now its pain and its struggle were broadcasting a new message. Not, "The meal is ready," but "Prey is hostile." The reinforcements were arriving. The sky above the observatory was breaking. That was the only way Arlen could describe it. The new distortions flickered into existence like cracks in a sheet of glass. Dozens of them, then hundreds. Each one was a small, localized wound in reality, a shimmering patch of wrongness. The clear blue New Mexico sky was becoming a shattered mosaic of itself. "They're not coming down," Maya said, her voice a strained whisper. "They're emerging everywhere." She was right. This wasn't an invasion fleet descending from the heavens. It was as if the hunters had been there all along, in a dimension pressed up against ours, and the damaged scout's distress call had given them the final key to tear down the walls between the two. Arlen watched horrified as a flicker appeared a few hundred yards away, right over Jed's abandoned pickup truck. The air wavered, and the truck began to change. Its red paint faded to gray. The metal sagged. The rubber tires deflated into puddles of black goo. The entire truck seemed to lose its integrity, its very concept of truckness being eroded, until it was just a vaguely truck-shaped lump of crumbling, featureless matter. "Their presence corrupts things," Arlen said, his mind struggling to build a framework for the impossible. "It's not just about eating. It's a side effect. They leak. The reality leaks into ours, and our world can't handle it. It's like pouring acid on a photograph." The distortions were spreading, moving down the mountainside from the observatory, following the road. They were flowing like a river of non-existence, heading directly for the valley where the town of Oro Grande lay sleeping. "We have to warn them," Maya said, scrambling to her feet. "There has to be a way." "Look," Arlen pointed, his heart sinking. A new set of distortions had appeared directly over the town in the distance. They were coalescing, forming a larger, denser vortex, just like the one that had consumed the building's entrance. The hunters weren't just following the road. They were drawn to the largest source of their food. They were drawn to the concentration of life, of consciousness in the town. The scout had been drawn to the observatory, the most active point of consciousness on the mountain. Now the main pack was going for the herd. A sound drifted up from the valley. It started as a low murmur and grew into a cacophony. Car alarms blaring, dogs barking frantically. Then the first human screams, faint but unmistakable. Maya let out a sob, covering her mouth with her hand. We're too late. Arlen felt a cold, crushing despair. They hadn't won. They had just escaped the opening skirmish. They had survived long enough to witness the main event. Humanity wasn't being conquered. It was being processed, like grain being harvested. A flicker of movement nearby caught his eye. It was a lizard, a little desert dweller, skittering across a rock. As it moved, it passed under a tiny shimmering distortion, no bigger than a fist, that had just formed in the air above it. The lizard didn't dissolve, it changed. Its legs multiplied, sprouting from its body in a chaotic twitching mass. Its skin shifted color, cycling through a rainbow of impossible, sickening hues. It was still a lizard, but it was a broken, corrupted version of itself, a biological glitch. It writhed in silent agony before collapsing. "It's not just unmaking things anymore," Arlen breathed. "It's rewriting them, randomly, chaotically." The hunter's reality wasn't just destructive. It was insane. It didn't follow any logic he could comprehend. And that was the true horror. They weren't just being eaten. They were being driven mad. Their very physical forms twisted into nonsensical parodies by an invading physics that had no respect for biology or order. "What do they want?" Maya asked, her voice hollow. "Why us? Why here?" Arlen thought back to the original ghost signal. the lure. Simple, mathematical, elegant. Something a developing technological civilization would be fascinated by. And then he thought about the server room. The hunter had ignored them at first. It had gone straight for the computers. "It's not us," Arlen said, the thought solidifying in his mind. "Not our bodies. That's just leftovers. They're hunting for consciousness, intelligence. Complex thought. That's the real meal for them." He looked at his own hands, at the intricate network of veins and the fine lines on his skin. He thought about his memories, his knowledge of astrophysics, his love for old jazz music, his grief for Jed. All of it. The sum total of his existence. "Our minds are a delicacy," he whispered. "A complex energy pattern they feed on. The signal was designed to find planets where that pattern had emerged, where matter had learned to think. The physical destruction, the corruption of matter, the gray dust and the twitching lizards, that was all just exhaust, the waste product of a much more terrible form of consumption. They weren't hunting humans. They were hunting humanity. The very idea of it." A new sound started to rise from the valley, overriding the screams. It was a chorus, 1,000 voices, all speaking at once, but not in words. It was a babble, a symphony of insanity. It was the sound of thousands of minds being simultaneously broken down, their thoughts and memories being consumed and regurgitated as meaningless noise. And layered over it all, faint but clear, was the sound from the signal. The wet, tearing, feasting sound. Phase 4 was fully underway. "We have to get away from the town," Arlen said, grabbing Maya's arm and pulling her away from the ridge. "Their field, or whatever it is strongest there. We need to go where they aren't." "Where is that?" she asked, her eyes blank with shock. "They're everywhere." "No," Arlen said, his mind clinging to a single desperate thread of logic. "They're drawn to complexity, to civilization, to thought. We have to go where there's nothing. Deep desert. Away from people, away from towns, away from anything that thinks." It was a desperate, insane plan. To survive, they had to become simple. They had to hide from the hunters by becoming no more significant than the rocks and the sand. They had to erase themselves from the mental landscape of the planet. They turned their backs on the smoking ruin of their life's work and the dying town below. They started walking west, into the vast empty heart of the desert, hoping to become too quiet to be noticed, too simple to be eaten. They were no longer scientists. They were just prey, running for the deep wilderness, hoping the hunters would lose their scent. The desert was a furnace. The sun beat down on Arlen and Maya, relentless and unforgiving. They had been walking for hours, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the nightmare unfolding in Ora Grande. The sounds had faded behind them, replaced by the whisper of the wind and the crunch of their own footsteps on the dry, cracked earth. They had no water, no food, no plan beyond walking west. Every instinct screamed at them to think, to strategize, to use their intelligence to survive. But Arlen knew that was a death sentence. Intelligence was the scent the hunters followed. To think was to light a flare in the darkness. "We have to stop thinking," Arlen said, his voice a dry rasp. He had been repeating it like a mantra. "How do you just stop thinking, Arlen?" Maya shot back, her face flushed, her breathing ragged. "The brain thinks. That's its job. Don't think of a pink elephant." "What are you thinking of right now?" He knew she was right. It was impossible. But they had to try. "Focus on the simple things," he urged, more for himself than for her. "The ground, your feet, the heat. One foot in front of the other. Don't remember. Don't plan. Just be." It was a form of meditation, a desperate attempt to quiet the complex symphony of their minds and become a simple, uninteresting drone. He tried to empty his head of astrophysics, of Jed's face, of the sound of the feasting. He focused on the pain in his blistered feet, the burning in his lungs, the grit of sand in his teeth. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, stark shadows across the landscape, they saw it. Ahead of them, in the middle of a vast flat plain, was a flicker, a small distortion in the air. They froze, their hearts seizing with terror. They were miles from any town, any road. There should be nothing out here for the hunters to be interested in. The distortion solidified. It wasn't one of the violent, consuming vortexes. This was different. It resolved into a shape. A perfect, gleaming cube of black, glassy material, about 10 feet on each side, hovering a few inches above the desert floor. It was utterly featureless, absorbing the light of the setting sun. "What is that?" Maya breathed. "I don't know," Arlen said, pulling her behind a large rock formation. "A probe, a marker." It didn't seem hostile, it just sat there, silent and monolithic. As they watched, a thin slit of impossibly bright light appeared on one face of the cube. It widened, and a ramp extended to the ground. An invitation. A voice echoed in their minds. It wasn't a sound, it was a pure, direct thought inserted into their consciousness. It was calm, rational, and terrifyingly alien. "The harvest is inefficient. There is resistance, damage to the crop. We offer a more orderly alternative. Enter, comply. The process will be painless." Arlen felt a wave of nausea. This was a new tactic. The hunters were adapting. The frontal assault on Oro Grande was messy. It had caused panic, resistance. Some of the crop was running, scattering. So they were trying a different approach. Deception. A promise of a peaceful end. A slaughterhouse disguised as a sanctuary. "Don't listen to it," Arlen whispered. His hands clamped over his ears, a useless gesture against a telepathic voice. "Your consciousness is a valuable resource," the voice continued, its tone unchangingly placid. "A complex energy matrix. Do not allow it to degrade in the wilderness. Preserve its value. Enter! We are authorized to offer incentives." An image flooded Arlen's mind. It was his ex-wife, Sarah. Not as he remembered her, aged and tired, but as she was 20 years ago, young, vibrant, smiling at him. The memory was so vivid, so perfect, he could almost smell her perfume. The cube was offering him a fantasy, a perfect, simulated heaven to walk into while his mind was gently harvested. He looked at Maya. Her eyes were glazed over. He knew the cube was showing her something too, her dream job at NASA perhaps. A reunion with a lost loved one. It was a trap, tailored to their deepest desires. "Maya, it's not real," he said, shaking her shoulder. "It's a lure. It's fishing." She blinked, coming back to herself, a tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "I know," she whispered, but it felt real. The cube seemed to sense the hesitation. "Your species is chaotic," the voice stated, a hint of something like disappointment in its tone. "Prone to irrational self-preservation. This complicates the collection. A final offer. Surrender your individual consciousness, and your species pattern will be archived. A record of your existence will be preserved. Preserved. Like a butterfly pinned to a board, a footnote in a cosmic encyclopedia of extinct species." "No," Arlen said, his voice low but firm. He wasn't just speaking to Maya, he was directing his thought at the cube. We will not comply. For the first time, the voice in their heads changed. The calm, placid tone was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp spike of annoyance. Unacceptable. The harvest must proceed. Inefficient methods will now be re-engaged. The ramp retracted. The slit of light vanished. The black cube began to glow, a deep, ominous red. A low hum started to emanate from it, the same resonance they had heard at the observatory. It was a localized tuning device. It was going to unmake this entire patch of desert, and them along with it. "Run!" Arlen yelled. They scrambled away from their hiding place, running blindly into the deepening twilight. The hum from the cube grew into a roar, and the ground behind them began to shake. Arlen risked a glance over his shoulder. The desert floor around the cube was turning gray and dissolving. But it wasn't just dissolving, it was being reformed. The sand and rock were reshaping themselves into sharp, metallic-looking spikes that thrust up from the ground, creating a deadly, growing forest of alien metal. The hunters weren't just destroying what they couldn't easily collect. They were turning the very environment against the escapees. The wilderness was no longer a refuge. It was becoming part of the trap. They ran, the forest of black spikes, growing and spreading behind them, a wave of hostile, terraformed landscape chasing them through the dark. The hunters' patience had run out. The time for subtlety was over. Now, they would simply rewrite the world until there was nowhere left for the prey to hide. The night was a frantic, breathless scramble for survival. The wave of terraforming pursued them relentlessly. The grinding sound of rock being twisted into alien metal, a constant threat at their backs. They didn't dare stop. To rest was to be overtaken and consumed by the advancing sterile landscape. By the time the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, they were exhausted, dehydrated, and utterly lost. They had escaped the wave for now, but they were in a world that felt increasingly alien. The sky was the wrong color, a bruised purple instead of a gentle blue. The few hardy desert plants they passed were twisted into bizarre geometric shapes. The hunters' influence was seeping into everything, a slow poison corrupting the planet. They collapsed at the base of a small rocky butte. Maya was barely conscious, her lips cracked and bleeding. Arlen wasn't much better. His thoughts were a sluggish, painful crawl. The forced simplicity, combined with exhaustion, had dulled his mind to a razor's edge of pure survival instinct. "We can't keep going," Maya mumbled, her voice faint. "There's nowhere to go." She was right. They had run from the observatory, from the town, from the cube. But they couldn't outrun the sky. They couldn't outrun the very air they were breathing. Arlen stared at the ground, at the red dust and the strange angular plants. He saw a line of ants marching near his boot. They were moving with purpose, carrying bits of leaf and sand. They were simple, organized. They were a collective consciousness, but a primitive one. And they were being ignored. The hunters were not interested in the ants. Their minds were too simple, the energy pattern too basic to be worth harvesting. And in that moment of numb observation, an idea sparked. A terrible, final, desperate idea. "The hunters are drawn to complexity," Arlen said, his voice a hoarse croak. "To individual consciousness, to the eye." Maya looked at him, her eyes dull with fatigue. "We know this, Arlen. It's why we're trying not to think." "But it's not working," he said, pushing himself up. "We can't stop being who we are. We can't erase our memories, our sense of self. As long as there is an Erlen and a Maya, we are a beacon for them. We are a meal." He looked at her, his heart aching with the weight of what he was about to say. So we have to get rid of them. We have to get rid of Arlen and Maya. What are you saying? She asked, a flicker of fear in her eyes. I'm saying the only way to hide the signal is to destroy the transmitter, he said, tapping his own temple. The human brain is the most complex thing we know of. It's a riot of thoughts, memories, emotions, a symphony. The hunters want the symphony. But what if we turn it into white noise? What if we turn it into static? He was talking about a form of willed self-destruction, a neurological suicide. He didn't know how, but he knew it was the only path left. To deliberately overload their own minds, to break the complex patterns of their own consciousness until nothing coherent was left. To become as mentally simple and uninteresting as the ants at his feet. How? Maya whispered, her voice trembling. How do we do that? Arlen's eyes scanned the horizon. The bruised purple sky, the twisted plants, the faint distant hum that was now the background noise of the world. And in the distance he saw them, a new group of hunters. Not the shimmering voids or the black cubes. These looked like people, a small group of them walking slowly across the desert. But they walked wrong. Their movements were jerky, uncoordinated. And as they got closer, Arlen could see that their faces were blank, their eyes empty. They were husks. Humans whose minds had been scooped out, leaving only the autonomic functions behind. The hunters were using them now as puppets. Drones to patrol and collect the remaining stragglers. One of the husks stopped, and its head tilted, an unnatural bird-like motion. It was looking right at them. They had been spotted. There's no time to figure it out, Arlen said, his voice urgent. He grabbed Maya's hands. We have to do it now. Overload it. Think of everything at once. Your first memory. Your favorite song. The chemical formula for rocket fuel. Pi to 1,000 digits. Every person you've ever met. Every word you know. Shove it all into one single moment. Don't organize it. Don't process it. Just scream it all inside your head. It was madness. An attempt to induce a catastrophic psychic failure. To short-circuit the soul. The husks were getting closer, their pace quickening. Look at me, Maya, Arlen said, his grip tightening on her hands. We do it together. We don't let them take us. We don't become their food. We don't become their puppets. We choose the ending. Tears streamed down Maya's face, but she nodded. She squeezed his hands back. A final, human connection. Arlen closed his eyes. He let the floodgates open. His childhood home. The smell of burning leaves in autumn. The face of his first-grade teacher. The theory of relativity. The taste of whiskey. The lyrics to a dozen Beatles songs. The image of Jed dissolving into dust. The sound of Billy's scream on the radio. Sarah's smile. Maya's face etched with terror and courage. Everything. All at once. A billion fractured thoughts colliding in the space of a single second. It was an agony beyond any physical pain. A feeling of his very being, his identity being torn apart from the inside. The symphony of his mind became a screeching, chaotic wall of sound. The complex pattern of Arlen glass was shattering, breaking down into random, meaningless noise. He was vaguely aware of Maya convulsing beside him, her own mind undergoing the same terrible process. The last coherent thought that surfaced from the wreckage of his mind was a strange one. He saw the ghost signal as it had been for 50 years. A simple, lonely pulse in the dark. A call. He finally understood its deepest, most terrible truth. It wasn't just a hunting call for them. It was a hunting call for us. A siren song for the lonely, the curious, the intelligent. A lure that called to the part of us that makes us human. And to survive it, you had to destroy that very part of yourself. The light of his consciousness, the thing the hunters had crossed galaxies to consume, flickered once, twice, and then went out. The last thing he felt was a great peaceful silence. The static had won. The world was a pattern of light and shadow, heat and cool. There was no name for these things. They simply were. A shape moved in the periphery. It was tall and walked on two legs. It had a face, but the face had no meaning. It was just a collection of shapes. It made sounds, but the sounds were just vibrations in the air, like the wind. The shape stopped. It knelt. It touched an arm. The arm belonged to a body. This body, the touch was a pressure sensation, nothing more. Another shape knelt beside it. This one was smaller. They were both patterns of color and form against the brighter pattern of the sky. There was no eye to perceive this. There was only perception. Raw, unfiltered data with no processor to give it context or meaning. Memory was a closed door. Identity was a word without a definition. The two shapes that had been Arlen and Maya sat on the red dust of the desert floor, their eyes open but vacant. They did not blink. They did not breathe in any rhythmic way. Their chests rose and fell erratically, governed only by the most primitive brainstem functions. The complex, beautiful, chaotic symphonies of their minds were gone, replaced by the profound, dreamless silence of erased hard drives. The husks, the puppets of the hunters, stood over them. One of them, a woman in a tattered mail carrier's uniform, reached out a hand and placed it on the forehead of the male shape. There was a faint hum, a flicker of disappointed energy. The hunters were scanning for the resource they sought, the complex energy matrix of a sentient mind. They found nothing. They found no fear, no hope, no memory, no grief. They found no science, no art, no love. They found only the simple, biological static of a body that was technically alive but functionally empty. It was like scanning a rock for computational data. The meal they had come to collect had spoiled. It had rotted from the inside out. The mail carrier husk tilted its head. The collective intelligence controlling it registered the finding with a cold, alien sense of frustration. This crop was defective, useless, not worth the energy to harvest. The husks turned and walked away, their jerky, unnatural gait carrying them across the desert in search of other, more viable minds. They left the two empty shells sitting under the bruised purple sky, leaving them to the sun and the wind. They were no longer prey. They were just objects, part of the landscape. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had no meaning. The sun moved, the shadows shifted. A tiny, crawling thing moved across a hand. An ant. The hand did not flinch. The ant crawled up an arm, over a shoulder, and disappeared. From the silent, static-filled ruin of what was once a mind, a flicker, a single isolated spark in the vast dark ocean of non-being. It was not a thought. It was not a memory. It was an echo. The ghost of a ghost. A word. Run. It vanished as quickly as it came, a flash of lightning in the dead sky. But it left a ripple. A tiny, infinitesimally small change in the static. A single, anomalous bit of data in the wreckage. The female shape's finger twitched. The male shape's chest rose and fell in a slightly more regular pattern. They did not wake up. Arlen and Maya were gone forever, casualties of a war fought on a battlefield no one could see. They had won their tiny Pyrrhic victory. They had survived by becoming nothing. But somewhere, in the deepest, most primitive recesses of their broken minds, a single instruction remained. A fossilized command from a long-dead consciousness. Survive. Across the planet, the harvest continued. The cities fell silent. Their inhabitants processed, consumed or left as empty-eyed husks. The hunters' great galactic trap had worked perfectly. They had found a world teeming with the resource they craved, and they were stripping it bare. They would move on eventually. They would set their trap again around another star and listen patiently for another curious species to answer their call. The universe was full of lonely worlds, shouting into the dark. But here, in the vast, silent desert of a dying planet, two figures sat motionless. They were monuments to a forgotten humanity. And perhaps, just perhaps, in the fullness of time, from the wreckage of their minds, something new and simple might learn to grow. Something that would know, from its very foundation, the most important lesson the universe had to teach. Silence is survival, and some calls are better left unanswered.